Hello, everyone, and welcome. I hope you are all safe and healthy. This is Burak Gören from RestartLab. I hope you enjoyed today's session and hope we have an amazing experience with Michele. Before moving on, I want to give you brief information about our organization, RestartLab. We call RestartLab as a cross-industry think tank initiative where we want to question and try to redefine the work concept. For that, we are exploring alternative ways to organize, and we are seeking human-centric, mainly working environment and organizational models. We are also questioning and mainly challenging the traditional way of working. For that reason, we have organized this fourth Restart Lab event to get inspiration from Michele Zanini about humanocracy. The full subject is Humanocracy, Resilient Organization, Great Jobs, and Zero Bureaucracy. I'm pleased to introduce you our guest for today, Michele. As you know, Michele Zanini and Gary Hamel wrote a book called Humanocracy, and it's a masterpiece for us who think there should be better ways for the New World Organization. He is also the co-founder of Management Innovation Exchange with Gary Hamel and also managing director in Management Lab. Welcome, Michele, again. Thank you for accepting our invitation. It's a pleasure meeting you here, and how are you?
Fine, thank you, Burak. Thanks for the kind introduction, and thanks for everyone to for your attention, for willing to spend an hour with us talking about some of the very topics that Burak mentioned, but that are obviously at the core of what you guys are trying to do at RestartLab. So let me just maybe share with you a little bit the agenda that I propose. I might just talk for half an hour or so, and then we can have a discussion, a dialogue. And what I might do in the setup to the dialogue is cover five things. First, make the case fairly quickly, I hope, given the crowd, of why we need to have a radical change in the way we lead, manage, and organize. Second, share with you some examples of organizations that have done that and have profited from that. Third, talk about the importance of new principles, new management DNA, if you will, into our organizations, and why principles are more important than practices. And the last two topics are really about the migration. How do you move from where you are to a new kind of mold, right? Because it's often quite difficult to do it. And you got to think about it at two levels, what do you do as an organization, and then what do you do it as an individual, right? So it's a lot of stuff. We don't have a lot of time, so I'm going to try to move very quickly through it and highlight some of the key points you'll find in the book. So let's get going and talk about why should we care, right? Why should we try to replace traditional bureaucratic models with something better? And let me just start here with a personal reflection, because I think this is true for Gary and me. So over the last few decades, we kind of developed the conviction that large established organizations are around the world are not as capable as they should and frankly need to be. And whatever the country you're in, whatever the industry, the sector, it seemed like large organizations just were incompetent at being able to intercept industry trends, at coming up with breakthrough innovation, or really unleashing the passions of people inside of them. And what we found is that at the root of this incompetence isn't like the wrong business model, the wrong operating model, but rather it was an outdated management model. It was an organizational problem, right? And let me elaborate this on a few minutes. So perhaps the most apparent of the incompetences is that our organizations are just not good at keeping up with turbulence, right? And when change happens, it's crisis-driven, it's episodic, and typically you need a change in the CEO position or to get our organization to focus on a completely different set of challenges and opportunities. So let me, maybe share an example. This is Microsoft. They've been kicking ass since 2014 when Satya Nadella took over, but people don't remember that for the 10 years prior to Nadella taking over, Microsoft missed every single strategic opportunity in the tech industry, whether it was mobile phones, tablets, search, online videos, cloud, you name it. And it wasn't that people at Microsoft didn't have any expertise or didn't see these opportunities, right? In a lot of these races, actually, Microsoft arrived at the gate on time, right? They had people that had cobbled together a prototype and who had a business plan for kind of doing search or whatever it is. But a lot of these efforts did not attract the top level sponsorship that they deserve, because they didn't fit into the worldview, the PC-centric, Windows-centric worldview of, you know, Bill Gates, not Steve Gates, Bill Gates and Steve Ballmer. And, you know, and once Nadella took over, he basically said publicly, you know, the biggest mistake we've made was to think of the PC as the hub for everything for all time to come. And eventually Nadella, you know, scaled back Windows and redirected investment towards the cloud business. And, you know, you might say better late than never, but this is an expensive proposition. Consider that even Gates, in retrospect, remarked on the cost of inertia. And he basically said, you know, we totally missed the mobile phone opportunity, the mobile operating system opportunity, and that opportunity cost us $400 billion in value. And again, this didn't happen because they didn't have the skills, right? It had a lot to do with the fact that Bill Gates and others were just unwilling to let go of preconceived ideas of, you know, what does success in our industry look like? And, you know, we don't want to make this a personal attack, right, on Bill Gates and Steve Ballmer. They're very smart people and they did a lot of great things. The real culprit is the organization and how it's structured and organized. You know, in a hierarchical organization like Microsoft was, you know, it's the responsibility of the CEO to set strategy and direction, right? And these people are expected to be uniquely farsighted and inquisitive and creative. And sometimes they are, but often they're not, right? And this is just a pretty good example of how often they're actually not very much like that ideal. So, inertia is a problem. The twin problem of inertia is incrementalism, right? So the reason why you can't intercept the future is because you don't have any good ideas, or you're not nurturing good ideas. And often, like, the new business models or the new shifts in the industry are dictated by startups that are not encumbered by the shackles of bureaucracy. And let me just give you another example. So this is about Eric Yuan, who in 2010 was the head of WebEx engineering, and he wasn't happy with the product. He thought it sucked. Like, it just wasn't good at holding large-scale conversations. It wasn't optimized for the mobile era. It just wasn't you know, really focused on the cloud and storing video on the cloud and all of that. And he begged a year and pitched his bosses at Cisco, because WebEx had been at that time a part of Cisco and still is, for upgrading, you know, WebEx for the cloud era, for the mobile era. And they basically said, you know, we're focused on enterprise social networking. That's our priority. So just like keep making incremental changes to WebEx and just leave us alone. And eventually he left because he was very frustrated, and he ended up creating Zoom, right, which we're all using today. And Zoom is, as you know, like the largest video conferencing app on the planet. It holds hundreds of millions of people having calls like ours every day. And there was a time during the pandemic in October where the market value of Cisco basically became, you know, was comparable to the market value of Zoom, about $150 billion. And it was just pretty crazy if you think about it. Just like one company that was an offshoot of Cisco being worth as much as Cisco. Now, market values have diverged since then. Cisco is worth 2x Zoom, but Zoom is still worth $100 billion, right? And that's kind of the price, in a way, of incrementalism. You can put a price tag on it, because, you know, Cisco could have easily have captured the value that Zoom instead captured. And the last kind of incapacity or inability of companies is about really exploiting the human creativity and passions inside them. Their organizations are in fact quite inhuman, and maybe it's a bit of a bold thing to say, but most people just don't bring their best self to work every day, right? And you might have seen this data from Gallup that says that only 15% of employees around the world are fully engaged in the work, which means that, you know, 85% are just not really bringing their ingenuity, their initiative, their passion to work every day. And a key reason for the lack of engagement is just lack of agency, lack of autonomy. You know, most people don't have the autonomy to exercise initiative. You know, you can see this summarized in a few workplace surveys that we mentioned in the book, but, you know, they all show that the vast minority of people believe that their opinions count at work, that they're free to take risks and to improve products and services. And despite all the hype about employee experience and all of that, you know, these numbers haven't gotten any better. In fact, for if you look at overall, like, more jobs are have less autonomy than ever before. So none of this is okay. And in Humanocracy and the work that Gary and I do, we're really setting out to change it. But it really shouldn't be surprising either, right? Because the roots are pretty old, and they date back to over a century ago when Max Weber, a German sociologist, talked about bureaucracy and the fact that it's the perfected when it's most dehumanized, and by that measure we've done pretty well, right? And in the search for discipline and reliability, bureaucracy has stripped meaning, judgment, creativity from work. In other words, bureaucracy has very little place for the things that make us human. The love, the intuition, the artistry. And you might say, well, bureaucracy is like such an old school term, like saying horsepower. Who talks about it like that these days? But and in many ways it is, old fashioned, but it does still remain the standard operating system for most organizations around the world. And you could just look at these traits on the slide and just ask yourself, how many of these apply to the organization I work in? And I would venture a guess that unless you're working in a startup or some sort of amazingly enlightened large organizations, most of these traits apply, if not all. And bureaucracy, while we can kind of pile on it today, made sense 100 years ago, right? It's something that generated a ton of progress and productivity improvements, right? So, but the challenge at the time was to get illiterate workers, mostly illiterate workers, to churn out products at scale. And we now live in a completely different world, right? Employees are skilled. They're not illiterate. Competitive advantage isn't just a product of being big, but you have to be innovative as well. And the pace of change is hypersonic, right? It's not glacial. Yet the foundations of management have remained cemented in this kind of bureaucracy. And today we need organizations that are more capable, that they're more resilient, that entrepreneurial, able to do kind of the both and, to explore and exploit, right? That harness and recognize the contribution of every member. And the word we created to describe this kind of organization is humanocracy. And you may like or not like the term, but we wanted to come up with something that was different from organizations and operating with the old bureaucratic paradigm. And we wanted to think about organizations and focus people's attention on creating organizations that maximize contribution as opposed to compliance. Now, you might think this is fantastic. I like the idea, but like, are you talking about unicorns and rainbows, or are there organizations that really operate in a way that is different from bureaucracy? And thankfully, the answer is yes. And let me just walk you through a couple of slides. So, we've been researching companies that are fairly large and very different in the way they manage themselves. And they do span a host of geographies and industries and the like. In the interest of time, I'm just going to go deep in a couple, or maybe not even that deep, but just to give you a glimpse. The first is Haier. They are the largest appliance maker on the planet. They're based in China, Qingdao, and they have about 84,000 employees around the world. 60,000 of them are in China. And CEO of Haier, Zhang Rumin, has been on a mission to basically turn every employee into an entrepreneur. And that's how he kind of talks about it. And it's an incredibly bold aspiration. And he's been really trying hard to show like a large company can be really entrepreneurial. And one of the things he did to make that happen is break up the company into 4,000 little micro enterprises. And these are little startups that some of them are focused on market-facing products like a new refrigerator and bringing that to market. Others are focused on manufacturing or design or IT or finance and logistics and the like. And they have basically created ways for these micro enterprises to interface with each other and enter into kind of an internal market of agreements where they specify exactly who's gonna do what. And the really interesting thing about these micro enterprises is that they're all tied together and share in the benefits or the cost, whether the product does well or not in the marketplace. So even if you're like in manufacturing, typically you're shielded from market pressure, or you don't really have a skin in the game as to whether the product you're making actually does well in the market. It's someone else's problem. At Haier, it's not. You are actually on the hook, and so it just focuses everybody's mind on the market and its outcomes. And one of the things that the CEO of Haier mentions is that everybody at Haier reports to the customer, and it's really true, right? Because everybody's on the hook to deliver marketplace success. So the other company that I wanted to highlight very quickly, which is completely different from Haier, is Bureaucracy. They're home health service provider in the Netherlands. They're the largest home health service provider in that country. They have about 16,000 care workers. Most of them are nurses, and they're organized in over 900 self-managing teams. And every team is given a territory of about 10,000 residents, and they're responsible for everything, finding the clients, renting the space for the office, recruiting other nurses, setting budgets, doing the scheduling, all of that. That's sort of up to them. They manage their own little startup. And within each team, every member plays a different role in addition to, doing the delivery to patients. So some are housekeepers and treasurers, others are performance monitors, others are planners, developers, mentors. And so these are part-time roles that people play. And all these nurses are trained and team members are trained in group decision-making, in active listening, conflict resolution, peer-to-peer coaching. So they really know how to do this, right? And as a result of that, the administrative structure is incredibly thin. They have about 50 people in the back office doing IT and 2 directors, including the founder, Joost de Blok. I mean, that's it. And the organization's overhead costs are, way lower than the average, and patient satisfaction, turnover, and other statistics show that they are delivering superior outcomes. So it's a model that is completely mind-blowing to most people in the healthcare industry, but it shows that it can be done, and it can be done really productively. And more broadly, if you look at not only these 2 companies, but some of the other ones I mentioned in that chart earlier, you get a glimpse of the kinds of practices that stand in real contrast to the bureaucratic status quo. And here's a list of some of them. But Humanocracy isn't really, even though it ends with ocracy, it isn't like holacracy, it isn't like agile at scale. That is, we're not necessarily prescribing at a very granular level a set of practices that are detailed and standardized, because the thread that connects a lot of these organizations together is less what they do and more how they think, right? And that's to us the fundamental takeaway. And so as we studied these organizations, we just kept asking ourselves, how do they end up with these crazy practices? And what you discover is that all these companies started with a set of principles, deep ways of thinking that are pretty unconventional in the corporate world. And this kind of makes sense, right? Because in any endeavor, you reach a point where you can't solve old problems with new problems with old principles. Like in the 18th century, if you wanted to champion self-government, you'll have to argue against the divine right of kings, right? And come up with a different kind of principles for legitimizing people in authority. So whether it's universal suffrage or freedom of the press or judicial review, things like that. And similarly, the principles of bureaucracy, the stratification, the quantification, the standardization, routinization, and so on, these are principles that are great at solving the problems of efficiency at scale and compliance at scale, but they're of no help when it comes to solving problems like innovation at scale, right? Resilience at scale, engagement at scale. In fact, they actually work to your detriment. So what we need to do is go to first principles and think about what are those values or principles that are really important to creating organizations that are truly capable and truly human-centric. And we identified 7, and I'm going to try to walk through these very, very quickly. So the first principle is ownership. Given the chance, most of us would rather be owners than employees. Whether you can work at a startup or not, you want to create a place where every team member has the autonomy and the upside that helps them feel like an owner, an entrepreneur. The second principle is meritocracy. All of us want to have a chance to be recognized for our contributions and develop our skills. And so we need organizations where the influence and the compensation are correlated with how much value you add, and not so much by the title you have or how tenured you are, right? And where decisions are not tainted by politics and bias. The third principle is okay. My slides are not working, guys. Let me see. Okay, here we go. Sorry. The third principle is market. And here, think about a market economy, right? So you have, as a consumer, a lot of choices, right? There isn't one place where you buy bread from or one place you buy clothes from. And markets are just better at aligning needs and resources than centrally planned economies. But most businesses, if you think about it, operate very much like the Soviet Union, right? Where people at the top, basically allocate resources and make most of the big decisions. And we think this needs to change. The fourth principle is experimentation. There's something satisfying about putting your ingenuity to solve a new problem, to come up with a new idea, to test it, to perfect it, to kind of pivot it, and so on. And experimentation is fundamental to the success of the business. It's the way you reinvent yourself, right, as an institution. The fifth principle is community. We all genuinely crave community, right? We're social animals. We generate a ton of strength, emotional strength, and resilience from being part of a group that knows you and accepts you for who you are, right? And it's why most organizations, to be successful, need to foster deep trust-based relationships. I mean, when we feel accepted, right, we do our best work, and our colleagues ought to feel like family, not just coworkers. And the sixth principle is openness. Tight-knit communities are vital, right? But at the same time, we want to be in environments that encourage creativity, curiosity, learning, and transparency and candor. And that means building organizations that are open to ideas, brilliant ideas, wherever they are, whether it's from further down the organization all the way to the top, or even frankly from the outside. And the last principle is paradox. And so when you look at companies like Hire, like Bertsorg, and many others, they're able to reconcile conflicting goals like scale and agility, innovation and efficiency, freedom and autonomy on the one hand, and discipline on the other. Think about the Bertsorg teams. They are delivering, they are working with patients. They can't just make things up as they go along and offer idiosyncratic and irregular care. It needs to be consistent, but they do that with autonomy at the same time. And getting better at these kind of either or trade-offs or transcending them requires giving every team member the information and the skills needed to make smart, real-time decisions as the situation demands. So those are the 7 principles. And the work of reinventing organizations, in our mind, for the new age, is to take these principles and then reflecting them deeply in the way our organizations work, in the management model. So you've heard a lot about operating models, about business models. You look at all sorts of canvases around those things. But you know what? There's a similar kind of set of kind of concepts that you can take for your management model. Like if you think about the systems and processes and structures that our organizations are run, they're really important, right? They inform choices around how resources are allocated, how people are rewarded, which voices get heard, which ones don't, how different units sync up with each other, and the like, right? So these are all levers, right, that you can manipulate. And the trick is to think about how these principles can inform these elements of the management model. And I'm going to try to make this concrete with one example. So take the principle of markets. How might markets and the kind of agility that comes from a market inform the kinds of practices and processes that you run the company with, and how do you leverage the wisdom of the crowd, right? And that markets are so well known for. And here are just a few examples. So, for instance, when it comes to planning, maybe you should use prediction markets. So when you are thinking about the sales of a new product or the prospect of new investments, try to tap into the expertise of the company and let them tell you whether they think it's going to be successful or not. Or create multiple funding pools for ideas, like adopting a little mini Silicon Valley inside of your firm, as opposed to the Soviet Union model where there's only one pot of money and it's allocated from the top down. Or create internal markets for talent where people gravitate to the best opportunities without this having negotiating a very convoluted HR-driven process for landing a new job. And remove maybe the monopolies for provision of internal services like HR or legal. How do they do that? There's not one place where you can go to get HR, manufacturing, or design work. There are multiple providers, so every provider is on their toes, right? Because if they don't have enough demand, they go out of business. So think about these kinds of ideas, and that's what really all the management vanguard companies, these management pioneers have done. They've taken these principles and thought very creatively and very deliberately about instantiating them in how they work. Now, let me just spend the last few minutes talking a little bit about the migration challenge, right? Because this is all well and good. These are exciting examples, but like, how do you make how do you make your journey towards this kind of a model? How do you move from a management model that energizes compliance to one that really emphasizes contribution. And how our experience is that the companies that have done so, that have embarked on this journey, and we in the book we talk about Michelin as one example, the global tire maker, but then there are also some other ones like GE Appliances, is that what you need to do is take the tenets of traditional change programs and kind of do the opposite, right? You need, because traditional change approaches are just not adequate, right? The fact of the matter is, most of our thinking about change management assumes that change is kind of organizational change is an engineering problem, like building a bridge, right? Something that you can kind of set from the top, and with the right experts, and you kind of lay it all out, and then everybody is given a plan, and they just need to execute the plan. And once you've executed the plan, that's it. Game over. You're done. You declare success and you move on. So there's a clear beginning and end. But we don't think that's the way systemic change in organization happens. I mean, you can maybe get away with this when you do an ERP implementation or something that is super straightforward. But if you're trying to change the very DNA of the company, you need something that is much more nuanced than this. And we think that people should stop talking about change management when it comes to this kind of change, and talk about hacking management, right? And by hacker, we don't mean the people that, the nasty people that steal your credit card data, right? But rather the people that post code on GitHub, right? People who don't wait to be asked. They don't think, oh, this is like someone else's problem. They take the initiative. They act as if they have permission, whether they do or not. And they tackle difficult problems in a community of passion, without a lot of top-down direction. And the term hacker came to prominence in the 1990s, and it was really originally a label for rebel coders who were committed to undermining the power, the monopoly power that Microsoft had on software. And the most famous hacker of all is Linus Torvalds, who released the Linux kernel in 1991 and basically said, help me make this better, right? And now Linux has 26 million lines of code assembled by more than 16,000 contributors, right? And we all get the idea of prototyping products, of lean startup thinking and all of that. But when it comes to business model or offerings for the customer, but when it comes to management practices, we're kind of frozen. And we feel like these can only change through divine edict, or like a new CEO that says, okay, this is the way. But we think that's just not a very productive and frankly very self-limiting myth. We can approach change, organizational change, in a much more effective way. This is a quote of my favorite quote of Linus Torvalds, right? And what he's basically saying is that to solve a complex problem, you need to syndicate the problem solving to a large group of people who then search for the best solutions and sync up with each other on what's really most effective. And we think that the responsibility for changing the organizations needs to be syndicated in a very similar way. Like, everybody needs to see themselves as a potential change leader. And you can think of management, the management model as being code-based. And management in a way is a social technology, right? So you can disaggregate the code base and have different teams work on different bits of it and innovate in parallel. And we call these kinds of innovations management hacks for this reason. And we just feel like that to build an empowered culture, you need a process that mirrors those kinds of values, or you need a distributed cellular approach, right? Because what you need to do if you want to take down bureaucracy isn't one giant reorganization to kind of vanquish them all, but rather a swarm of hacks, like a whole kind of much more organic way to get there. So let me just give you very, very quickly a sense of what this might look like in a company. This is based on Adidas, work we did there. The CEO was keen on creating a more innovative company. He felt like he just didn't have all the answers, neither did his team. And so what he said was, let's just open this up to everyone, about 3,000 people, and let's see what they have to say. Like, how do we change our management model so it can be more encouraging of innovation as opposed to frustrating innovation? So, this started with a simple question, come and help us reinvent the organization. And a community of about 3,000 people over several months, about 3 or 4 months, took part in a set of sprints, problem-solving sprints, where every sprint was a principle from Humanocracy, like markets was one of them. And there's a little lecture explaining to people what we meant by that, but then we really opened it up and said, okay, what is your idea? How might you take this principle and change the organization? And some of the ideas that I mentioned earlier, the prediction markets, crowdfunding, internal markets for talent, those are the kinds of ideas that people started generating. And this was all transparent, and the whole community was involved in this. So you could see other people's ideas and like and iterate them with them. In the end, thousands of ideas were generated, and then the community converged on the most promising one through a process of peer review. So it wasn't some like Shark Tank panel at the top to determine which of these management innovation ideas were interesting. It was the community that kind of filtered them and prioritized them. Eventually, the best ones, were brought together. The members of the teams that had these ideas brought together for a 2-day workshop where they thought and were taught about how to take these ideas and turn them into really cheap experiments. So there was one idea called Adigogo, which was a crowdfunding idea, and they basically, were given, I think a couple of days a week for a month, $20,000 to run an experiment, and then some mentorship from an executive who was willing to help them. And they generated a really cool experiment where they used no technology at all to test crowdfunding, but rather had a whiteboard in the e-commerce division, about 100 people. And, the people posted their ideas to be funded. Everybody was given $200. And in the end, it was an amazing success, and it has scaled since. But, the notion is, take these grand ideas about reinventing work and make them super practical and super experimental and try them out in a slice of the company, right? That's the way to go, right? And a lot of these ideas didn't work, but many of them did, and they've really informed and changed the culture and made it okay. And in fact, and started to encourage people to think about changing management practices and being involved wherever you are, even if you're like a junior brand manager or someone managing a retail store, right? Everybody is invited and taking part of that process. So, and then maybe, this slide is I think a good one to share with you. So the idea is that you want to have a bold goal, you want to reach humanocracy, you want to bust bureaucracy, but the way you get there is through a series of experiments, right? And it's these experiments could be progressively more challenging. So maybe you don't start by blowing up the compensation system right away. Maybe that's the last experiment you run. But the idea is that you evolve your way to a new model in a very kind of gradual experimental way. So you can be very bold in your aspirations, but very kind of practical and very experimental in the way you get there. So it's a little bit like metamorphosis for an insect, right? So you go from caterpillar to butterfly, and it's a crazy change of function, but for the animal, it's not, right? And it's a very gradual process along the way. So we think that's the way to go. And last slide, and then I'll just stop yapping, is really about like what you need to do as an individual, because so far I've talked about hacking management and changing the system, which is great. But at the end of the day, your change starts with you, right? Every one of us can catalyze positive change in our organizations. And I'm going to leave you with maybe 5 steps you could take. So the first is to just share your power. Involve, if you're a team leader, if you have people working in your team that are kind of reporting to you formally, involve them in decisions that you would otherwise be expected to make, whether it's coming up with the initial budget for your unit, or putting people, having one of them represent you at a meeting with your peers, and giving that person the information and the power to make decisions on your behalf. Second, debureaucratize yourself. Take a look at the mirror and examine how your behavior is a bureaucratic behavior. Maybe you're kind of undermining a colleague, or you're just not trusting of your people, or you just think that the best way to cut costs is to cut headcount, as opposed to coming up with some other way that doesn't assume that people are just like fungible commodities. But there's so much that we've inherited from old ways of thinking, whether it's in business schools or management literature and the like, that sometimes we just need to start questioning those assumptions, and that will help us see the world in a different way. Third, create a business case for change. I mean, this is not just a moral imperative, but it's a business imperative. We've created a little tool called the Bureaucratic Mass Index, which you can find on our website, and I'll put a link to that at the end. But it's a way for you to start benchmarking yourself against the other companies on like, how much time do we waste? How many layers of management do we have? How difficult is it to get money to run some experiments like that IDIGO experiments I mentioned earlier? And you can start to create a fact base around that. The fourth is experimenting with these hacks. At Adidas, we did this at the level of North America, so there was an institutional kind of support for this. But there's no reason you can't, in even a smaller unit, you can't start hacking away at processes that are within your control. It's definitely something you can do and you should do. And the last one is really just to involve others. And so the idea is that if you have a brilliant hack, right, don't try to go up the chain and sell it, because that often will get the idea shot down, right? What you need to do is work laterally, involve other people, say, hey, can you try something similar in your part of the organization, and so on. Build a coalition, because it's much easier to say no to one person coming up with a new idea, and much harder to add, to say no to a whole group of people that says, we want this, we want to try this out and spread it more broadly. So, change really does begin with us. And so I urge you, wherever you are, just, broaden the circle of change, work together with colleagues, and build organizations that they elicit and really deserve the best that each of us can give. And, we really do need nothing less than this to thrive in the 21st century. So with that, let me stop. I'm going to put up a slide here that has some information on where you can find me, and you can check out humanocracy.com for a variety of tools, as well as a course that you can take where we go much deeper in some of these ideas. And with that, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Michele. I'm amazed by your speech, and I believe the audience has enjoyed as well. So, being the moderator, I will use my chance for the first question of my own. You say zero bureaucracy, so why do you emphasize on zero? You also mentioned Buurtzorg in your speech. So one of our previous guests, Gerse from Buurtzorg, told us a very striking saying about self-management. She said that self-management is like pregnancy. Either you are pregnant or not. You cannot be half pregnant. So is it the same for bureaucracy, but in a negative meaning? So can we have a little bureaucracy and use it in some limited extent in our organization, or will it grow like a cancer?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's a good question. I mean, zero bureaucracy in a way is the aspiration, but, and again, it depends what you mean by bureaucracy. But if you go back to the list of features I mentioned, I mean, to be perfectly fair, even at Buurtzorg, there is some bureaucracy in the sense that there's a chain of command, right, of some kind, but it's incredibly limited, right? So so to me, I think, you need to have, or even Nucor, which is, or even higher. I mean, there is a hierarchy, but even though there are these trappings of bureaucracy there, the interesting thing is that the way that they're interpreted quite differently. So even at I'd say higher, so they have these micro enterprises. That's really the engine of progress. But then they do have, leadership inside of each of these micro enterprises, and these people do have more authority than other people. But if they don't perform, they get kicked out by their team, right? So you do have hierarchy, but it's reimagined in the sense that the people who are leading are accountable to the led, right? And so at the surface, you might say, well, higher still has like a hierarchy. So like, what's the big deal? Well, the big deal is, as I mentioned, is that the responsibilities of those in the hierarchy are quite different. So is that zero bureaucracy? Is that 5% bureaucracy? In a way, it doesn't really matter. I guess what's true is that they are nowhere near the norm, and it can be done. And they've created a system where bureaucracy doesn't grow back, because the way bureaucracy does grow back, and it often does, is because you do have these old ways of thinking about authority and decision making. And so, I worked at McKinsey for many years, and you get involved in these efforts where you're like, oh, the organization has become really inefficient, so let's just take out these layers of management and so on, and they don't really add a lot of value. But then you go back 5 years later, and it's like they've grown back. It's like grass, you mow the lawn and then it grows back. So unless you change the seeds or make sure the seeds don't grow very fast, whatever, I think you're not solving the issue. I hope that kind of answers your question.
Sure, thank you. So I was keeping an eye on questions in parallel. there are good questions for which I really wonder your answers. So let me pick the first one. From Eric, he said that those that need to drive these changes from the top have often more to lose to gain, especially when incentivized short term. How to change this chicken and egg problem?
Yeah, no, it's a fundamental barrier for sure. It's like, in the in the US, the people say turkeys don't vote for Christmas, right? So, um, the way I would say is the following. Um, First, try not to start at the top and convincing the people at the top that change needs to happen, because if you want to, that may take a long time. And start building the case for change from the bottom up in a concerted effort if you can across units, and then they may end up being they may end up joining you, for those at the top, when they see that the whole organization is shifting towards the agenda that you push for. We have a brilliant example, I think, in the book of the National Health Service. It's just like a pretty bureaucratic organization, the healthcare provider in the UK, and a person who decided to create a campaign for around patient centricity. And she didn't ask for permission. She did something online saying, what's your pledge for improving patient care for the next year? And it went viral, and hundreds of thousands of people engaged with that. And then the people at the top are like, oh, well, this is really great, I'm going to support it. But had she gone to them with this proposal, they would have said, no, it's like, no, we're too busy, go away, right? But she did. She's like, screw this, I'm gonna catalyze a coalition. So anyway, so that's number one. Number two is make the practical case, and we also the moral case for change. In the book we talk about Michelin, where they went through a transformation, started. There was a realization at the top, they had done lean, they had all sorts of efficiency improvements, and they got into a flat part of the curve, like they weren't improving productivity anymore. And so people said, maybe the way we need to do this is by empowering people, because they know how to drive productivity forward. And so they pitched it as sort of, let's try this in a few different parts of a few different teams in the production arena, and let's see where it goes. So for the CEO, it was actually quite easy to say, oh yeah, well, this is like there's a business case for this. And they're not asking to blow up the company, so yeah, sure, let's have it happen. And so I think those two things, just frame it as a business problem, and then make it really easy for them to say yes. Because if you go to them and say, oh, you need to change, and by the way, you need to kind of cut your pay 50%, and you need to cut your decision rights by this much, and that's not going to work anywhere. But there are ways to make them understand that this needs to happen, and make them comfortable that this is the right answer.
Okay. And the next question, companies are obsessed for profit and making shareholders happy. Can we really convince these companies to prioritize humanity first?
I don't think there's a big trade-off between profits and people, or profits and purpose. I think that's maybe in some cases there is, but they're limit cases. I think most companies are so far away from being really productive and really high performing and treating people right that they can do both at the same time. And in fact, a lot of the companies we feature in the book are not companies that lose money. They're like the leading companies in their industry, and they're prioritizing people first. So I sometimes think that the companies that are short-termists and complain about shareholders holding them back are the companies that basically where the management has no real good ideas on how to evolve their business. And so the investors treat you accordingly. Amazon, they don't have myopic shareholders. They see that, or Tesla, they're changing the world, right? And in the case of Tesla, they're helping the planet. And so I think by blaming it on shareholders, you're kind of giving a lot of unimaginative managers who want to, kind of an excuse to stay in power, and you're not really putting pressure on them, because they could do so much more to, as I mentioned, to do both, to improve the people experience, as well as the productivity and the profitability of the firm.
The next one is a short one. How can we make contribution transparent and visible for everyone?
How can we make contributions?
Transparent and visible for everyone inside the company, I guess.
Inside the company? Well, one thing you could do is to start, and we have a whole chapter on meritocracy, which is a loaded word these days, but we still believe in the concept, because it can be corrupted, right? And it often is, but we think it's still worthwhile to think about it. But you can crowdsource your performance reviews and make performance be something that is attested by your peers. So it's not your manager who says, whether you've done a good job or not, but, the people you work with, the people that are exposed to you. And we have good examples of how that's done in a couple of different organizations. One is W.L. Gore, the material fabric, and industrial products maker and medical products maker. They have the way they evaluate people and for compensation purposes every year is that they, everybody produces a list of people that they've worked with. And then those people get polled and said, how much value has that person added to the firm? And they do these pairwise comparisons so that they say, let's say that I've been exposed to Jane and Jill. Jane and Jill would be this, is Jane added more value than Jill, right? And they do these pairwise comparisons for thousands of people, and you have thousands of comparisons. So a hierarchy of contribution emerges, and then they pay people accordingly. That's how they do it, right? So in that case, contribution is incredibly transparent. And it's really what's driving, it's your peers' understanding of a contribution is what drives everything. So I think if we could do more things like that, we'd all be better off, surely.
Sure. And the next question is, why share power is the first thing to do, but enrolling others is the last? How can you be successful if not start enrolling others from the start?
Yeah, well, I don't think of those things as a sequence. You can kind of do them all in parallel. That's totally fine. I just listed them as 5 things, but they're no, yeah. I do think though that starting with yourself and like in your perimeter, in your perimeter and just trying this out for yourself is invaluable because it's basically, there's a way, in cognitive behavioral therapy, when you're trying to change behavior, people say you need to act in your way into new ways of thinking, right? As opposed to thinking your way, new ways into, thinking into new ways of acting, right? So you need to experience it yourself, and that really leads to lasting change. So, but certainly enrolling others is just as important, and I wouldn't leave it for last.
Okay. The next one is Humanocracy possible without small and cross-functional teams? Can it live in a classical functional organizational structure?
Well,
Like
so one example we have in the book that is very functional is Morningstar. They're a tomato processor. And what they do is, even though they have different functions, or even Nucor, they make steel, and there are these different aspects of a very functional process of making the steel. So within each function, that you can certainly have self-management, right? There's no reason why, if you're like managing one particular piece of the process, you can't create small teams within it. And then what they do is that they do have ways of linking these different teams together in some sort of cross-functional whole, right? So and that's often done through compensation. So you might share in the gains of the cross-functional process, whether it's making steel leaving the door, right? So there are both elements. There's both small teams inside each function, and then some way for these teams to be plugged in together across, often through compensation and other mechanisms to facilitate coordination.
Okay. The next one is somehow a classic, but I think it's a valid one. Do you think these Humanocracy principles are applicable in all cultures, like Eastern or Western?
Yeah, I think I don't know if they apply to like planet Zarkon B or whatever, where they're not human beings, but I think as far as humanity, I think there are very human principles. There's no reason for, and some, what might change is how they're implemented, how they're interpreted, right? That might change quite a bit across culture. So the way, but the fact that all these companies have them in some way or another is telling me that these are reflective of human. And by the way, there may be other principles. These are the 7 that we found. I mean, there may be variants of it. There may be things that you might want to include, like diversity, other things. But these are, I think, fairly generalizable principles. And as I mentioned, what changes might be the local interpretation of the principle. Just like, democracy is universal principle, and then there are different kinds of modes of democratic governance around the world. Like a similar kind of parallel, I think.
Thank you. And the next question is matching with something in my mind also. I think you have worked with McKinsey for a long time. So I think the next question somehow addresses that. Do you think big famous consultancy companies can really help their clients to move towards more agile, humanocratic organizations?
I think they can. I think it definitely can. They have the installed base, they have the customer relationship, they have really smart people working there who can really drive this kind of change and support clients with it. And it can happen, and I'm somewhat optimistic, maybe more so than I was even 5 years ago, because you are seeing a lot of the rhetoric at least being embraced. And I've had conversations with former colleagues of mine and people at other companies, and I think there are people who are really serious about it in consulting firms. So, I'm hopeful it can happen. What we need to guard against is just this being like the flavor of the month, right? Which has happened, right? So you can just basically, I mean, the thing that drives me a little crazy, back to the principles of our practices, is this whole popularizing of certain models, like the Spotify model. You guys must be aware of that, tribes, squads, whatever, all that stuff. And so there are some, some people say, all you need to do, you need to kind of create the Spotify model inside of your company. I'm like, well, cut and paste isn't going to work, right? I don't think it's going to work. And so you need to be a little bit more serious about it than that, saying, hey, cut and paste and you're done in 6 months, you're like Spotify. That's not as easy as you make it sound. So, but I think a lot of serious consultants are engaging now in ways that maybe even 3-4 years ago I hadn't seen. So I'm hopeful.
I know that there is nothing wrong with the people, because you also, Lalux, are from McKinsey.
Right.
Yeah, but I think there is something wrong with the system of that consultancy thing, but that's just my opinion.
Well, it's also, it's hard, it's cause and effect, because consultants in a way give clients what clients want. So how much of it is demand driven? How much of it is supply driven? Probably a little bit of both, which is why I think we also need to change our expectations for what business leaders do and think, right? Because then they'll start demanding different things.
Sure. Okay, I think one of the last questions. More and more people seek meaning at workplace, and that's why purpose becomes increasingly popular. But is it really healthy? Is wholeness really possible?
Well, I think of purpose maybe in a maybe more prosaic way or more mundane way, that people get fulfillment from what they do, and sometimes it may be tied to some sort of lofty purpose, but often it doesn't have to be, and it's really determined by the quality of your reality at work every day. Like, how much autonomy do you have? Are you sharing into the upside of the productivity that you create? Are you having meaningful relations with colleagues? And like, let me just give you a very good example. Like at Nucor, they make steel. I mean, they're an environmentally friendly company and they use recycled metal. So, there's a part of it which is sort of let's save the environment. But people don't say, oh, my steel has a purpose. Like, it's like, what's the purpose of steel is like build stuff, and that's perfectly fine. You don't have to have, your steel doesn't have to save the planet, but they all feel incredibly committed to each other and to their work, because it just gives them, it helps them flourish and gives them meaning. So like the fact that, so I don't think you need to have toothpaste that has a purpose, or work at a company where like your cereal for breakfast has to have a purpose. And the purpose, like it needs to be very personal. And I don't think it's something that HR or the communications department that Unilever or whatever creates for you. And it really is driven by the work environment. And I think most people don't have that, right? I mean, I don't know if you saw Danone, they just fired the CEO of Danone, and he was all like, was very keen on, big on purpose and saving the planet and so on. But the company had very mediocre results. And, so, and in the end, like other companies like Unilever and Nestle also are very purpose driven. They were doing better. So purpose often is used as a panacea, or as a way to make people feel the company that they work for is cool. But I think maybe I'm a little cynical about this, but I do feel often it's not very deep, and therefore it doesn't really make much of a difference. And you can be much more humble about purpose and finding it wherever you are without, the kind of the pretense that you're saving the world,
I think this can be the last question. Our time back is nearly over. The paradox is that for an organization to transform, first the leaders need to be convinced, but are very reluctant to give up their power. So how can we do it?
I think you can work at both in parallel, and I don't think I would necessarily start with the leadership, because as I mentioned, it might take you a long time. So I'll give you a quick example, and it depends what you mean by leadership, because there are different levels. But at Michelin, so the people at the CEO level were saying, okay, fine, we need to find a way to empower our frontline people, and they were kind of at the highest level, kind of on board with that idea. But they weren't then convinced of anything more meaningful than that. Then the work really went to the plants, and so teams of 30 people and leaders inside of those teams saying, okay, I want to be part of this experiment. I want to try to create a more autonomous workforce. And they worked on that for a year, and the leaders are like, oh my God, this is really good for me too, because like instead of being woken up at 3 a.m. because the night shift has a problem and I need to fix it, I can have a better life. I can sleep at night and I can work so like people realized that this was like really, it was win-win. It wasn't like a zero-sum game. And then from the team level, they went to the plant level and worked on this kind of dynamic. And then from the plant level, they worked at the corporate level. So they went kind of back from the bottom up with some kind of support from the top. So I think that's a better model. But the thing that is important with that model, it's not like isolated bottom-up experiments, because those can be killed really quickly. So what you need to do is the bottom-up needs to be lateral at the same time. So they had multiple plants running these bottom-up experiments, right? And so you create a level of evidence and credibility that allows you then to scale to the next level. So that's more the approach I think you should take. You don't want to leave the executives too far behind, right? So you need to keep them up to date. You need to kind of get them comfortable with what's going on. But, I wouldn't spend all my time trying to convince them, because that might just not get you very far.
And I think that's the end. Thank you, Michele. I think we are truly thankful for your invaluable contribution and inspiring speech today, and for the answers to the questions. I guess we are heading to the end of our session. So thank you for your time and for being with us today. We'll be hosting other exciting guests in following months. So again, stay tuned for our new event announcements. Stay safe and have a nice evening. Bye. Thank you, Michele.
Thank you. Take care. Bye-bye.